Chapter 3. Because She Was Engaged. By the time we returned to Baylor, even Meyer knew I was head over heels in love. For me, it happened the second Val and I met, or to be more precise, the moment the gentle breeze carried her scent to me. Being enamored was one thing. This happens frequently in college, but what I felt went much deeper than a passing fancy. Intuitively, I understood this. By the time Meyer and I passed over the Mississippi River, I made an internal decision to marry Valerie Jean Garrett. Like everything else that happened during the course of the previous 24 hours, feeling this way and making such a life-altering decision was new ground for me. I had never entertained similar thoughts before, not about any girl. Once the idea solidified in my mind, though, it wouldn't budge. If guys know what they want, they can be totally committed. I had witnessed it before, but when I did, it always seemed bewildering. Now that it had happened to me, I understood the dynamics completely. Like a blind man who gains his sight and sees a rainbow for the first time. Having made my decision, I became fixated on it, never deviating one iota. Until something like this happens to you, it may seem a little crazy, but when it does, your eyes become opened and your perception changes immediately. Instantly, it seems like the most natural thing in the world. You actually feel sorry for people who have never had the experience. At least, that's the way I felt about it. Women seem to understand these things better than men. It's why they are constantly looking for guys who are capable of experiencing deep love, while rarely finding them. Girls intuitively know this kind of guy makes the best marriage partner, just as long as the man's feelings aren't based on possessiveness or jealousy. When that happens, the girl needs to run. Relationships based on dysfunctional needs and cravings never work. Unfortunately, most girls end up learning this lesson the hard way. Guys too. Then there's another type, the guy who doesn't know what he wants. Either that or he doesn't care enough about a girl to move forward. What he wants is the benefit of an exclusive relationship without the responsibility that comes with it. In a relationship like this, all hell can break loose, and routinely does. When a girl falls for a wishy-washy guy, she comes to regret it. I certainly wasn't ambivalent about Val, nor was I jealous or possessive. Realizing she was engaged, I also knew the importance of letting her handle her situation with Appleyard, without any pressure from me. It wasn't that I was the epitome of maturity about this, I wasn't. The truth is, it caused me anxiety regularly, but I also knew that any pressure I might exert would become counterproductive, producing an outcome I certainly didn't want. I knew what I wanted, and I hoped Val would come to the same conclusion, which I felt certain she would, in time. Because of our circumstances, I was just a little ahead of her, that's all. Nevertheless, my steadfastness was unwavering. She recognized this, and I think she liked it. I was careful not to overplay my hand, though, fearful of scaring her off. Once Val became a part of my life, she never left my thoughts or my heart for an instant. Nor did I budge in my desire to marry her, not once. Being ambivalent was never a consideration, and I let her know this in numerous nonverbal ways. I didn't even have to try and be like this. It was just the way I was. I couldn't help myself. Because I was so solid, she knew she could count on me, and that's precisely the way I wanted her to think. In some ways, I guess I really was like my dad, who was equally immovable about what he wanted, like his insistence that I attend Baylor. When I returned to class on Monday, following my trip to Ole Miss, although I was fatigued, I was able to focus on my studies without becoming distracted by all of the pretty co-eds, something that had never happened before. Interestingly, because I became disinterested in Baylor's co-eds, several became more interested in me. I'm not sure why, but this dynamic seems to occur frequently. If you're not in a relationship, you rarely meet someone who interests you. When you become romantically involved, however, other potential suitors just seem to pop out of the woodwork. For whatever reason, life seems to work this way. Knowing that I wanted Val and nobody else, I regarded myself as taken and acted accordingly. It wasn't difficult. I just stopped paying attention to other girls, which was obvious. Although not initiated by me, word of my Ole Miss romance got around. A couple of girls considered bringing me back into the fold to be a challenge. Being taken made me more attractive. Go figure. Despite their efforts, they were wasting their time, which they eventually realized. Finally, admitting failure, they abandoned their fruitless mission. Things were different for Val. She couldn't simply make a decision to be with me like I had made about her. Because she was engaged, she had to deal with Charlie in her own time and in her own way. To avoid even the semblance of pressure, I never brought up his name, nor did we speak about him in our daily telephone conversations, which became a sizable financial expense, by the way. Back then, you paid for long distance by the minute, and we spoke for hours at a time. Regardless, Charlie's presence was always there, a constant reminder that my life was on hold until Val's situation resolved. We got to know each other on the phone quite well, but it wasn't the same as being together. Because we had only known each other for a short period and had been separated for so long, I wondered if her fervor would wane. Obviously, I was concerned about this. The thought that our romance might fizzle and die was terrifying. But there was nothing I could do about it, not being 600 miles away. Despite my intentions, our future was out of my control, except for praying about it, which I did constantly. Only time would tell whether or not the outcome would prove to be lasting. There was nothing in the world I could do to guarantee the outcome, which was difficult for me to accept. As winter faded, bringing the rolling hills of central Texas to life, with colorful bluebonnets and numerous other wildflowers, I made plans to visit Val. Canceling my long-standing commitment to spend spring break with my friends in Port Lavaca, Texas, I chose to travel to Pascagoula, Mississippi instead. This was where Val was spending the week with 4 of her sorority sisters, girls who were also her closest friends. Never having been to this part of the Gulf of Mexico, I was surprised by how beautiful it was. It wasn't Texas, of course, but it wasn't bad. Regardless, no geographical consideration was of the slightest importance. I would have enjoyed spring break in Fargo, North Dakota if Val had been there. When I arrived at the spacious house in Pascagoula, which her Chi Omega sisters had rented for the week, I stretched from my long trip after getting out of the car. As I was doing so, Val walked out of the house to greet me. When I saw her, she was sporting a broad smile, which I returned. Anticipating my arrival, she looked even lovelier than the day I first met her, if that was possible. Out of the corner of my eye, I noticed she wasn't wearing her engagement ring, which might indicate her betrothal had ended. I certainly didn't say anything about it, which would have spoiled the moment we had both anticipated for so long, but I did wonder. I also noticed her sorority sisters had come to the window to take a good look at the guy from Texas who had stolen Val's heart. She had informed me that several of them thought she was a fool to even consider breaking off her engagement with Charlie, because he was sharp, handsome, from Mississippi, and about to finish law school. They reasoned he was a far more suitable candidate for marriage than any charmer from Central Texas who was majoring in history. On paper, their assessment seemed to be on target, even to me, but I suspected marriage to Charlie was no longer something Val considered to be an option. At least, I hoped that was how she felt. That she considered me to be a better candidate was affirming and extremely gratifying, as you can imagine. Because Val felt this way, some of her girlfriends were perplexed. Others were irritated. Nevertheless, while our future remained uncertain, I was cautiously optimistic. I realized this was the most important trip I would ever make, which meant the first impression I made on these young ladies was crucial. This was clearly evident that afternoon. The girls at the window scrutinized every move I made, especially when Val greeted me. Walking up, she kissed me warmly, which was more like embracing an old friend. Her kiss was without the slightest hint of passion. Nevertheless, she moved into me unhesitatingly, in a tender and accepting way. Knowing her sorority sisters were watching every move we made, Val was careful to refrain from any display of affection they might consider to be inappropriate. She knew that if she breached protocol, even slightly, that she would be judged mercilessly by her friends. Girls can be like that, especially university Greeks, who are often a heartless lot. Even though they were her sorority sisters and her closest confidants, they could become ruthless in their criticism and condemnation. Having been forewarned, I responded to Val's kiss appropriately, never broaching the line of unacceptable familiarity. Like all guys, I didn't have a problem with public displays of affection, but girls are different. Being proper is a big deal to them, as most guys come to learn the hard way. Val was so concerned about our initial meeting, she gave me specific, detailed instructions about how I was to behave and how I was to dress. She told me what I was to wear, which I found comical, but I followed her detailed instructions to the letter. I was to wear Weegians, gold cup socks, pressed khaki slacks, and a starched button-down light blue Gant shirt with the cuffs turned back twice. She insisted that I be clean-shaven, with my hair having been cut no more than 10 days prior to the trip. I was instructed to not even bring a pair of cut-off jeans, despite the warm weather, which seemed a little over the top to me, but I followed her directives scrupulously. To Val, it didn't matter that I was tired. After having driven 600 miles, I had to look the part of someone who was a model for Life magazine. When I pulled up to the rental house, I had to present myself precisely the way she had instructed, without deviation. I was to look perfect, not for her, but for her sorority sisters, who would dissect me in every way imaginable, pouncing on any flaw I might manifest. Instead of allowing her daunting instructions to be intimidating, I accepted the challenge and played the role masterfully. I was a Baylor Bear, after all, and certainly no slouch, not by any Ole Miss standard. After our brief embrace, Val took my hand and led me inside. While walking up the front steps of the house, I could hear her sorority sisters scampering and giggling as they raced from the upstairs window to greet me. When one of them opened the front door, their welcome was one of the warmest I ever received, despite several of them being dead set against Val pursuing our relationship. Girls can be funny about things like this. After being introduced to each one, we had a late lunch, with me being the center of attention. I would have loved this, if I hadn't been so hungry. Between bites, I did my best to be gracious, charming, and entertaining. It wasn't a difficult assignment. Who wouldn't enjoy being the center of attention, surrounded by 5 beautiful young ladies? Shortly after the meal began, my wariness about these bubbly young ladies evaporated. I laughed heartily at each of their jokes and stories, enjoying myself immensely. Several giggled throughout the meal, which made it a delightfully unforgettable experience. What was difficult was finishing my sandwich. They were so intrigued by who I was and what I had to say, they wouldn't allow me to eat. They asked me one question after the other. Questions like, what does your father do? What are your plans after graduation? What about other girls? Have I ever been in a serious relationship? Would I consider moving to Mississippi after graduation? The questions came a mile a minute. Val's friend, Bitsy Burkett, who had dated Charlie briefly before he and Val became an item, seemed to be the most curious. Their inquisition went on and on, but I had been forewarned this would happen. Val informed me it was a rite of passage for prospective beaux at Ole Miss. She expected me to be up to the task, which I certainly was, despite being tired from the long trip. Truthfully, not only did lunch end up being great, but the entire afternoon was also fabulous. I thoroughly enjoyed myself, but what I really wanted was to be alone with Val. I'm sure this was her desire as well.